packed with rich history, stunning temples, mountainous views, innovative technology, and delicious cuisine, it is no surprise Japan is a popular destination for many to teach English abroad. But is teaching in Japan right for you? Hey Go community, my name is Ashley from Go Overseas, and in today's video, we're going to answer some popular questions when it comes to teaching English in Japan. In addition, we're going to go over the pros and cons you should consider when deciding if teaching in Japan is right for you. Before we get into the good stuff, the pros and cons of teaching English in Japan, we want to answer a few questions you might have when it comes to teaching English in Japan. Is it difficult to become a teacher in Japan? So compared to other countries, Japan does have stricter requirements. For example, a bachelor's degree is required, a TOEFL certification is highly preferred, and some job listings might require a year or two of prior teaching experience. If you're ready to teach in Japan, we recommend watching our latest video, the 7 best online TOEFL certificate programs. In addition to the education and experience requirements, you're going to have to go through a criminal background check and some health checks in order to teach English in Japan. However, don't let this drive you away from teaching English in Japan. When it comes to teaching abroad or studying abroad, these are pretty standard processes and documents that you will need in order to apply for your visa. Question number 2, what are the teaching opportunities in Japan? There are many different teaching English opportunities in Japan for all different types of skill levels, but the ones I'm going to mention are the most common for entry-level ESL teachers. So you can be an assistant language teacher, also known as ALT, through the popular Japanese government program, JET. In this program, you will teach K-12 in public schools across Japan. In addition, there are opportunities to teach in private language academies or schools, and also private lessons. It is important to remember that each opportunity will have its own specifications and requirements when it comes to applying. And number 3, a very popular question and valid concern is, do I need to speak Japanese in order to teach English in Japan? Although speaking some Japanese or having some knowledge of the language prior to moving to Japan will definitely help you with your immersion, it's not a requirement to teach English in Japan. In fact, there are actually some programs that offer free Japanese lessons for their teachers to help with their immersion. So let's talk about the reasons why teaching in Japan may be right for you. So depending on the teaching job that you have, salaries will vary, but the average is between $20,000 and $30,000 a year. Now I know coming from the US, this average might seem a little low, but it is enough to live in Japan. You'll most likely live or work outside major cities, therefore the cost of living will be a little bit less, and some job opportunities offer additional perks that help offset the cost of living. Some opportunities might offer a housing stipend, others a SIM card for your phone, providing lunch when you're teaching, and cover transportation costs. These perks will help offset living expenses, and with a little budgeting, it is possible to live in Japan. Collaborative classroom environment. So as a teacher or an ALT, you will be responsible for planning and delivering lessons in the classroom. A perk of being a teacher is being able to observe and interact with your students and get to see what their interests are. And this is super helpful when it comes to lesson planning. That way you can incorporate what you're observing and their interest into the lesson planning to make learning and the classroom environment more dynamic. Being a teacher is an excellent opportunity to learn about the country that you're living and teaching in through your students. And that is a really unique perspective and way of viewing a culture and a country. For my personal teaching abroad experiences, I have found that students are actually the best teachers. You will learn about your own language, your own culture, through students and their questions, their curiosity, and what piques their interest. Because honestly, it is one thing to speak your language, and it's another thing entirely to be able to teach that language to other people. Students are some of the most curious individuals. Some questions will leave you amazed and completely shocked and a little speechless, and other questions would honestly just amaze you of their curiosity and their interest. It's also a really great opportunity as a teacher to learn about Japan and Japanese culture, everything from important holidays and festivals and their history, and everyday slang phrases from your students. Nearly every corner of Japan is accessible by train, and the areas that aren't very walkable are best explored by bicycle. Japan is a nation that depends on things running efficiently and on time, so you can rest assured that you will arrive on time. This is particularly an important pro when it comes to teaching and living abroad, because if you're coming from a city or a country where you're not used to depending on public transportation to get around, having a transportation system that is efficient, dependable, and safe really helps adjusting to life in a different city. How could we not mention Japanese cuisine as a pro? I mean, it is regarded one of the best cuisines in the world. Japan's loyalty to its craft, especially when it comes to food, is incomparable. People dedicate their whole lives to perfecting their craft, finding the right balance between textures and flavors. And honestly, there's so many dishes to try when living in Japan. Of course, there's sushi, ramen, soba, kaiseki, and so much more that I don't think we have enough time in this video to name them all. Being able to experience the food firsthand and at the same time learning about the history just adds to the overall experience of teaching abroad in Japan. Now we're going to chat about some of the reasons why teaching in Japan may not be right for you. As a teacher, you might be working in the public school system, and that means that you might actually be traveling between 3 to 4 schools a day in order to give your lesson. This can definitely add to your commute time depending on where you live, and the schedule can be quite tiring. Living and working in Japan can make you feel isolated, especially if you don't speak or understand Japanese and you're living in a small rural town with few other teachers and expats. This can definitely heighten your feelings of isolation. It can cause making friends and building a community a little bit longer than maybe it would take somewhere else. However, I do want to mention that this feeling of isolation and loneliness isn't unique to living in Japan. Although it is true that it might be easier to meet other expats and make friends in other cities, that feeling of loneliness and homesickness is something you will encounter in any living abroad experience. If this is something that you're worried about when it comes to teaching in Japan or anywhere else for that matter, we have resources on Go Overseas on how to deal with homesickness and loneliness while abroad. The third con we want to mention is cost of living. And the reason why I want to mention cost of living is because compared to other countries in Asia or other popular teaching destinations, the cost of living in Japan is considered relatively high. And if your goal while abroad is to save money or to do a lot of traveling, then the cost of living is something you should definitely take into consideration when deciding if teaching in Japan is right for you. As a general guide, we want to give you an idea of what it costs to live in Japan. So let's go over the average monthly expenses. For rent, you can expect to pay anywhere between $450 to $750 US. If utilities are not included in the rent already, you can expect to pay between $100 to $350. For groceries, anywhere between $300 to $400 a month. Cell phone plan, $15 to $30 US. And transportation pass can be anywhere between $50 to $150. A few things to keep in mind, depending on the job that you have while you're teaching in Japan, some of the costs that we mentioned might be covered, like your cell phone and your transportation pass. And the groceries can be offset because some of the schools and job opportunities do offer lunch while you're teaching. Remember that this is just an estimate and the average cost of living varies across Japan. If you're living in a big city compared to living in a small rural town, your average monthly expenses will definitely vary. A good tip is that if you have an idea of the city or the town that you want to teach in, look up the monthly expenses for that specific region or area. That way you'll have a better idea of what it actually looks like to live in that particular city. Depending on the school environment that you teach in, you may have to work long hours until 9 or 10 p.m. for students coming after a regular work or school day. And the long work days can limit you from creating a social life outside of work and therefore affecting your overall work-life balance. Furthermore, work isn't always over when you leave the classroom. In Japanese culture, going out with your colleagues for a drink or karaoke is very common. Although these outings may not happen every evening or every week, it's considered something to be very important to keep the harmony among the group. You also may be required to work some weekends and at school events. And lastly, our final con is the challenging workload when it comes to teaching English in Japan. Although this is something you might experience only if you go through the JET program, we wanted to mention it as the program is actually a popular option for many who choose to teach English in Japan. Being an ALT, your role is to support the primary teacher in the classroom. And so therefore, you might actually be working with many different teachers throughout your time teaching. Working with different teachers, each teacher might have a different style of teaching or different idea of executing the same lesson. This will require you to be highly flexible and get very creative to adapt the same lesson plan to different executing styles. And this, for new or inexperienced teachers, can take time to adjust initially. And although a con, many view it as an opportunity to develop and grow their soft skills when it comes to flexibility, adapting, and creativity. So to recap, we went over some of the most popular questions when it comes to teaching in Japan, the pros and the cons of teaching in Japan. And now we have to answer the question, should you teach in Japan? If the idea of living and working in Japan excites you, you are ready to take on the challenge of long work days and have some prior experience teaching, then teaching in Japan is right for you. If you're ready to start your Japan adventure and want to learn how to become a better teacher and learn the programs available, then check out our guide, Teaching English in Japan. The link will be in the description. Have any questions related to teaching in Japan or teaching abroad in general? Let us know in the comments below.